climbed to the top of a pyramid, looked down, and there, lying beneath the collapsed altar of a temple below, she spied a shimmering crystal skull.
Now, the actual pyramid where she was lowered down into, that pyramid doesn't exist?
Well, what they did is they've somehow taken it down. She said that it was a large pyramid, and they kind of took the top off of it. You know, I never take anything for face value. I always try to weigh it out. She never wavered from what she said of finding it here. It left no doubt in my mind that she was here. She did find it.
But were the Maya capable of making such an incredibly intricate object? I spoke with Dr. Jaime A, director of the Belize Institute of Archaeology.
Do we know if the Maya were crystal?
Oh, certainly. We have found crystal objects in some cave sites that I've worked in. So, yes, the Maya crystal is a very important, very interesting, very significant type of rock.
Do they have the technology to create something like the crystal skull?
I am totally convinced that the Maya were capable of producing these types of objects.
Still, Jaime A doubts that the local Maya crafted the Mitchell-Hedges skull. And though Anna Mitchell-Hedges claims she found the crystal skull at Lubantun, Awe and other researchers question her story.
Anna does not appear in any of the published sources about Lubantun. I don't know that she was ever there. Can you go out just a little bit? Sure.
In fact, Jane Walsh, an anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., thinks she knows where it came from.
Mitchell-Hedges purchased the skull in London in 1943. I have copies of the catalog when the sale took place. I know how much he paid for it.
But Bill Holman has a different interpretation of that story. He says Mitchell-Hedges had left the skull with a friend, and the friend's son had put it up for auction. When Mitchell-Hedges heard about it, he rushed to Sotheby's.
And Mitchell-Hedges got there, but he could not get it out of auction because it already had been put in, and it was already listed. So he had to bid on his own skull to get it back.
In the past, Walsh has examined some of the most famous crystal skulls, 2 at the British Museum and 1 in the Smithsonian's own collection.
Welcome back.
Using an electron microscope, she first took images of an ancient stone carving. She says that the ridges look rough and irregular because the artist used primitive tools.
Essentially, pre-Columbian carving, Maya, most or if not all Mesoamerican people use stone and abrasives to carve.
Now, look at this image taken of one of the skulls. Notice the perfect parallel ridges. Walsh believes these marks appear to have been made from a diamond rotary saw. That would indicate that the skulls could not have been made before the late 1800s. To learn more about the possible age of the Mitchell-Hedges skull, Bill Holman brought it to Jane Walsh for testing at the Smithsonian.
I took some silicone molds of some of the carved elements of the skull, which I later looked at under a scanning electron microscope. They indicated to me that it was carved using quite modern equipment and high-speed polishing tools, and certainly not consistent with the story that it's pre-Columbian.
So does this mean the Mitchell-Hedges skull is not one of the purported 13 ancient skulls? Not necessarily. Some crystal skull experts see those same tool marks as evidence that a civilization vastly superior to our own must have made them. And they mention other scientific tests that disclose some incredible characteristics. Remember the Hewlett-Packard laboratory test done by Frank Dorland in the 1970s? In that examination, the reported properties of the Mitchell-Hedges skull seemed miraculous, almost otherworldly.
Frank Dorland, who studied it for Hewlett-Packard, actually came to the conclusion that the skull might well be over 12,000 years old. And what he found about the crystal skull completely amazed him. He found that it would put out all kinds of sensory phenomena, from sounds to smells, and that particularly the skull would actually glow and light up at certain times.
And they also discovered that the skull was made of a particular type of quartz known as piezoelectric silicon dioxide, which we now use in all our electronic devices for information storage and communications. So maybe there's something in the original legend that said the skulls are containers of great knowledge or means of communication between the worlds.
So think of it as a kind of a solid state CD, a three-dimensional CD, and the optical properties of Mitchell Hedges indicate that someone was giving us clues that there's complexity here. You should preserve this, you should iconize it, you should worship it, you should keep it safe until you have evolved the technology to read what it says.
One of the most interesting things that some people say they've seen inside the crystal skull is the image of a UFO.
Up next, we enter a sacred Maya site where the ancients made a dire prediction about 2012.
For the first time in 26,000 years, the Earth is lining up with the galactic center of our Milky Way galaxy.
A coming cataclysm that only the reuniting of the skulls can prevent when Mystery of the Crystal Skulls continues.
Several of the most famous crystal skulls have been examined, yet more questions have been raised than answered. Anthropologist Jane Walsh believes the Maya were not capable of fashioning crystal skulls. Other researchers say the skulls could even date from the time of the legendary Kingdom of Atlantis, over 10,000 years ago. First mentioned by the Greek philosopher Plato, Atlantis was reportedly a mighty power that conquered much of the known world. Plato said it was located somewhere beyond the Pillars of Hercules.
Supposedly, the Atlanteans had a very high technology. They built giant ships. They built giant cities and ports and things like that. They would have been able to work with crystals and create crystal skulls.
But ultimately, the story of Atlantis ended in tragedy. At the height of its powers, Atlantis is said to have sunk beneath the sea in a day of terrible cataclysm.
Where did they go? Well, the whole idea is that there are earth changes. Occasionally, the earth goes berserk, and there's huge earthquakes, huge tidal waves, tsunamis, volcanoes go off.
In 1923, just before Mitchell Hedges journeyed to Belize, famed psychic Edgar Cayce proposed that the Atlanteans used a mysterious form of crystal energy as a power source. Stories of this fabled civilization originally drove Mitchell Hedges to Belize.
He was a believer in Atlantis, and he felt also that there were vestiges of Atlantis in Belize, in Honduras, and in certain islands of the Caribbean.
And being the kind of character he was determined to prove this. They'd heard rumors of a lost city said to be still buried in the rainforest. That he might find evidence of the lost civilization of Atlantis.
What Mitchell Hedges stumbled upon was new.
It is unusual because it's not built